Blackbox is actually one I read, must have been probably close to 10 years ago. I don't know how old it is, but it must have been soon after it was out. I remembered it was a great book. But when you compare it so closely with Rebel Ideas, they're basically the same book. A lot of the times he uses the same examples and evidence.
Yes.
But I love that argument. I believe very much in that, learning from failure. But I just don't see his point of why would you write two books on the same subject?
A lot of people do. A guy called Colin Wilson wrote over 100 books, and many of those were not the same book, but he was circling the same problems again and again and again and again throughout his life. I'm not uncritical. I don't think he's cynically getting book side. I think he's circling the same ground. That's what I think.
Yeah.
But what do you guys think?
My feeling from the book was, from an organizational and a systemic point of view, it does cover it really well, but it doesn't really cover an individual that deeply. Most of the problems originate from an individual. Yeah. And these fears, these things, if he could have just applied to an individual and just covered that bit about an individual, that could have been a completely separate book from Rebel Ideas, because Rebel Ideas does again the same thing. It covers the system. But in this book, I felt that he could have covered the individual much more deeply. That what are those fears? He covers it from a systemic point of view. He could have covered it from a personal point of view. Why not? That could have been a great addition in that sense. I felt been done.
There's a guy, Ben Hardy. I don't know if you've come across him. I think that's his name.
Yes.
Dan Sullivan's probably the original coach. I think he's called strategic coach. He's got a lot of brilliant ideas, but he's never really come into the mainstream book-wise. And a student of his, Ben Hardy, is like one of the most prolific writers on Medium. And he's just basically taken each individual concept, Progress Not Perfection, and made a book of that. And then I can't remember the book, Who Not How. And he's someone who's done that really well, just by taking an idea and making it so much. I read one of them. So I read Who Not How and something about progress or perfection. And I read another, and it was too baby. Like he'd overdone the point, but he does dumb it down so it's much more widely read.
Yeah. Is it dumbing it and making it more accessible?
I think in the first two that I read of his, they was making it more accessible. And then the third, it felt like there isn't a point. I think that's the reason Dan Sullivan partnered with him, was because he knew he had the knack of making it much more accessible to a much wider audience.
I thought the same as you. When I'd finished the book, I really did like the book and I rated it.
Yeah.
But when I finished, it almost felt like writing another book and saying, look, if you want to know about failure, this is all you need to know. Just this, nothing else, no footnotes, no references, nothing. I'll just give it to you straight from the horse's mouth. This is what you need to know. And it was all personal stuff about what it feels, whether your feelings are justified, whether your feelings make sense or whether they don't, whether just it's in your head. One of the things that Syed doesn't do, talk about what I call safe failure and unsafe failure. He just treats failure as all the same. I had a day when I was 14, and if I'd failed, I would have died. I'm not being melodramatic. It's just the case. I would have died. I had to succeed just to stay alive. I had to. But years later, when I was doing Forex trades, everyone I lost, I was gutted. I was absolutely gutted. Even if there's no money on them, you just think, oh God, I'm wrong. Instant feedback. You're either right or you're wrong. There's no ifs and buts. There's no getting away from it. And everyone I didn't get, it was like, I'm a bad person. And I felt this way for years. It sounds ridiculous, but I'm not the only person to feel like this. And in the end, after many years, I came up with this thing. You are not your trades, because I'd let the results of the trading define me. Yeah.
Yes.
I know this sounds ridiculous because you're standing outside it, but if you were in it with the same emotion, you'd probably feel the same way. Think, oh God, I'm a failure. When I won, it was okay. That was all right. But when I lost, oh God. And I was winning more than losing, but he really doesn't talk about safe failure and unsafe failure because they're two completely different things. You can learn from safe failure, but God, don't try and learn from unsafe failure.
I think the seminal idea of the book that you can learn more from failures than from success. Like he gives the example of Kodak versus Fujifilm and all those examples. I was mentioning on LinkedIn, I think in a recent post, I came with a breakthrough in my research, the book that I'm writing, to learn much more from success than from failures. Because when you are succeeding and still you are analyzing, on both occasions, when you are successful and you are analyzing, you are much more likely to succeed in future because you have the confidence, you have the psychological safety. If it would have been the case that you learn more from failures than from success, then why do football teams who start losing, they keep on losing? Why are they not learning from the mistakes? And why are they still losing? And when you get on a winning streak, why do you keep on winning? Because in both occasions, you are learning. As long as you are analyzing, you learn much more from your successes than from the failures. That was a breakthrough for me. I always considered, we always try to put failures on a pedestal, our society and everything. They try to put failures on a pedestal. Yes, you learn more from failures. Okay, that is the truth. That's how to make the society comply.
I remember that post because when you said that, Michael, I was trying to think where I'd heard it, but there was someone, and it may have been in your post, if you referenced something about, but I remember reading something about it, like parachutes or something like that. Someone was talking and they said, we can't fail. I'm not sure where I got this, Rebel Ideas or somewhere, but basically it's 3 failures. Like a big failure is 3 minor failures. There's 3 points that break down. Right. It's not just one thing happens. I can't remember where I read it. I think it was from a book.
This could be maybe, Rob, what you are referencing is Barbara Frederick theory on broaden and build positive psychology. She mentions that you need 3 positive emotions if you have to encounter 1 failure. So that's how we are wired that way.
The name rings a bell, but it wasn't in connection with that. Where does this idea come from? It wasn't Rebel Ideas then, clearly. But there was 3 points. There was this time when it could have been picked up. Then there was another time when it could have been picked up. And then there was a third time. And it was when all 3, like the communication broke down. It may have come from somewhere else, but it was referenced on the mountain in there was this point, there was this point, and there was this point. And I remember, I think it's somewhere else I've picked it up from. But when they asked...
Fire into thin air, but the oxygen.
I've not read that, but it may have been someone referencing that.
But it's referenced in Rebel Ideas. It's in
right.
But there were several times where they could have communicated, but they didn't.
Yeah, and it boils down to somewhere where there's some research or something that there's generally 3 points of failure. So it's not one failure, which we typically think, it went wrong. It's not like in the medical case, it was not reacting, not picking up on this clue, so it's generally more than 1 point.
But the reality for people and companies is that they make mistakes all over the place every day. And that many failures, if you think of a visible failure as the top of a pyramid of a load of mistakes, there are tons of mistakes. There are far more than 3. There can be 33. There can be 3. There can be 3,033. But they don't quite make it up and it all blows up. It really is the case. I've worked in those places. I've seen it. All those mistakes creeping away. The way companies are successful, I agree. What you should analyze, but I knew loads of people that didn't. They just thought, hey, we're on a roll here, guys. And then when they started to go under, all the mistakes came out. But they should have been fixing them when they were doing well, not when they were not doing it.
When you talk, Saurabh, in football, I think of the Liverpool team of the 80s. What they had was a culture and it created an identity of we're winners. I've read into this, and Paisley was a terrible manager. In the sense, he wouldn't talk to people. He would hide from them when he wasn't going to put them in the team and all of these things. They were having punch-ups on the team bus, but it was holding each other accountable. If you made a bad pass or whatever, then you would get it. This is not what we do, because success can breed that culture. And you see that with Man City, where they've developed this. And you also see it with Arsenal and Liverpool, where it's taken them, like Arsenal maybe are challenging this year, but it's taken them, they've challenged, they've fallen short, they've challenged, they've fallen short. But it's that sense of rising up and their identity of being capable of winning. So I think there's something in that.
Yes. I feel a lot comes from competition, like having a worthy rival, like that is extremely important to push a person, a team, an organization towards success. I feel, again, this is not covered in the book directly, but when we are talking about marginal gains, for example, in this book, these marginal gains come from not only analyzing what the organization is doing, but also analyzing competition and benchmarking against your worthy rivals. That could have been a point that could have been captured in this book much more brilliantly, I feel. Like, why not take cross-sectional examples from other industries and try to improve on, don't rely just on the data that you have. That will limit your chances. Why not try it try to get the data that is already available and study the rivals, the worthy rivals that you have, and try to take the best from them as well. That's also something that I feel the book could have explored in that sense. Since Rebel Ideas and this could have been a much more interesting book if you could have made it wider by applying these kind of thinking models.
I think Matthew Syed, he's not been in the corporate world, so I don't think he really knows. He's a journalist looking in. And so I don't think he feels this way. I think if he'd been in the corporate world, he would feel this way. He hasn't. Could be everywhere. So he was a table tennis champion, so it only goes.
Yes.
I also feel that there's a very unitary perception of organizations that they're all here to do this, that, and the other. That's not the reality of organizations and companies. There are all sorts of vested interest, power groups, people competing with other people.
Yes.
There's all sorts of stuff going on, really. And a lot of that is not helpful, but you need to be very aware of it if you want to succeed, really. But I agree, you should obviously find out legally and ethically as much as you can about what your competitors are doing and learn from them. Very often they'll talk to you anyway. A lot of these marginal gains, I'd call them cumulative gains because it's doing the basics and making sure they follow through. The marginal gains should only come in when you're really pushing the envelope.
I just wanted to ask, how do you guys perceive what is the difference between a marginal gain and what is the difference between Kaizen, that the concept that has always been in organizations wherein there is continuous improvement? So how do you see marginal gains different from Kaizen? Is it a concept that is new in your eyes, or is it something that has always been existent in the culture of organizations?
I think it's always been there. I think what's happened now, we used to think of strategy and tactics, and now everything's called tactics. People do a list of 10 things on LinkedIn. Sorry, everything's called strategies. People do, it's not trend strategies, it's a list of 10 things, for God's sake. So I think the same thing's happening with marginal gains. Everything's a marginal gain. It's not a marginal gain. It just isn't. And one thing, this doesn't answer your question directly, but I will answer. Marginal gains can be very useful in athletics where the top of the athletic curve has been pushed and there's very little to get left. There's nothing down below. That's all been done, really. There's very little left. I know a lot about it from high standard rough climbing because you're constantly analyzing. People climb at absolute limit. The slightest thing can make a difference. And marginal gains really kick in then. But in a Kaizen sense, if those Kaizen things aren't there further down, you're wasting your time with mine. You're just absolutely wasting your time. And people will do that. They'll get this pair of amazing rock shoes, but they've got shoddy footwork. There's no point doing it. Address your skill first. So I think if you can ask marginal gains and Kaizen, I'd say go for Kaizen every time. Get the basics nailed. Make sure you're nailing the basics. That's what I'd say. But you may feel differently.
I'm like Matthew Syed. I'm not really versed in corporates. Mine has been more through people. So I look in and I hear other people's experience, but I don't have a lot of referential experience of working within an organization. It basically just seems that they were basically doing the same idea, but they just called it something else. And again, I can see within a sport, you're constrained. There's the rules that someone else has set. So you are at the best, and it is fractions of a second of who's better or fractions further or whatever. Within an organization, though, for most organizations, you're not bound by those limitations. And so I like the bit about you get marginal gains, but that only takes you to a certain plateau. Marginal gains is only really for mastery. So I think most things, like you well know, you've written a book on it, so the 80-20 principle. But for most things, you just do the 20% that'll get you the 80% results. But I think there is something that you need to master. And for those things, the marginal gains are worth pursuing. But it's so much better when you can look at a different industry, like the Dyson example, where you come up with a different way of making Hoovers. That's something you're pretty constrained at. Once in a lifetime, someone will break a different way of, I think Usain Bolt changed the way of sprint running, and Jamaican runners made some breakthrough in that. The Fosbury, was it? The
Fosbury flop.
Yeah, and psychologically, right, so Roger Bannister with the 4-minute mile. But other than that, most sports is marginal. Most companies coming up with a new iPhone, iPhone or iPod is a revolutionary, which is going to have much more impact. But then how often does that happen? It takes the right
Exactly.
the right environment and the right.
There is a very clear distinction, I feel. If you are going that marginal gains route, you can only go so far. You will always reach that. Whereas when you are doing these marginal gains, you also have to, especially in organizations, you also have to be very aware of the radical innovation that can also take place. New technology coming in, which is disrupting the market. So if you are hell-bent on those marginal gains and Kaizen, I've seen a lot of traditional organizations fail in this way. Even the example of, say, Kodak, it shows just that you are so focused on those continuous improvement, because Kodak was one of the pioneers of continuous improvements. So they did all those continuous improvements and made the organization. And another thing that Syed mentions, the sunk cost fallacy. You have so much sunk cost attributed to the things that are functioning so well that you forget or undermine the radical innovation bit, wherein you also need the new ideas, or you have to cannibalize your products in order to grow in the market. That's something that I think the book captures very beautifully. That part, especially the Kodak example, that captures it very beautifully, that how just looking at marginal gains can undermine radical innovation and stop you from changing the course altogether because of all the biases that we have as organizations, as people, due to the cultural roots of the organizations. All these do take place.
I completely agree with you. In my experience, if an organization is winning, it's very difficult for them to do anything else but what they're doing, because they're winning and their whole careers are vested on their self-esteem. Everything's vested in it. And the whole thing, you could argue, is a massive sunk cost, because one day that's not going to work. And the time to start thinking about the day it doesn't work is while it's still working. But they don't do that. They just go on and then it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
And usually in my experience, it's too late then. You should get in the corporate world, Rob. It's really...
Actually, I do know Kodak. My dad worked for 43. 40.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay.
Kodak was a massive local employer in Harrow in their factory. And actually, while I was setting up my gym, I worked there for about 10 months while I was waiting for leases and things to go through. That wasn't the first time that Kodak missed the ball. They were the ones who came up with the instant technology of
digital camera.
Yeah, or even before like the Polaroid camera they'd missed, and then the digital. And so the factory that we had at Harrow was, and where I worked, was all professional film. And so they were so invested in selling to like professional photographers, and they'd sunk so much cost into the manufacturing and to the paper, and they were the biggest source of radiation in the UK because it's all dark room. And obviously I was very low down working on the factory floor. So there becomes a complacency, isn't there? When you're at the top, you're a rich organization, which I think is what you were Blockbusters, that you're so, because your way is working, you are blinded to everything else. And in the sense, if they were chasing every opportunity and everyone had come to them, I'm sure Kodak and Blockbusters both had millions of people pitching them with crazy ideas. So it's easy when you look at talent agents and book publishers who would reject the Beatles, who reject J.K. Rowling, all of these people, but they were over and over again. And it's because when there's so many opportunities, you can't take them all. It's hard to really look from their perspective. I don't know how you would deal with that as an organization, because your bread and butter is going to be keeping the organization going. But then maybe you need someone like Steve Jobs, or someone who's completely free thinking, perhaps separate from the organization, who, like Dyson, manages to continually find, because he has that mindset. And maybe that's what organizations need, someone outside of the organization, the normal organizational structure, but who has time. Google perhaps are one of the best examples. They're talked about in that they do lots of kind of trials, like they've had crazy trials of getting rid of all managers, and they do a lot of research into teams, and they do a lot of research seemingly into everything that they do. So maybe that's the way organizations could work.
I don't think people want to work that way though, Rob, because there's too much sunk cost in people's careers. The whole ethos of management is control. Every company in the world will say they value creativity, but creativity by its very nature implies lack of control. So I'm not saying you can't have both. You can, just not at the same time and in the same way, really. Yes, they need people from outside, but do they want them? And in my experience, the answer is a huge resounding no. Things may have changed now, but I very much doubt it.
There is so many entrenched problems, like the problem of short-term pay, where the CEO's pay is linked to next next quarter's results or share price. A lot of the systems, for me, looking in, you look at whole human resources. Why would you call people a resource? People aren't.
The most dreadful term ever. Absolute deplorable term. Personnel wasn't great. It's far better than that. Why would you call people resources? Yeah, agreed.
I know what people want because I'm used to talking to people and I'm used to people moaning about their boss, their work, their partner, all of that stuff. So I know what triggers them. And that's not making people real value. From the industrial age, it makes perfect sense. Largely, the basic core mindset, the framework and the structure is still that kind of factory of control. You still need a sense of control and you still need a structure, but it needs to be adapted to the work that we do.
Yeah. I think a framework which is called the Ansoff matrix actually covers this part. There would be certain star products which need continuous innovation. Then there are cash cows, which are your bread and butter, from which you get the maximum profit. And then there are dogs which need to go away after a point of time. They are at the end of their life cycle. So understanding that growth of various things, like various products within the organization and classifying them rightly and putting that effort accordingly is something that organizations that are really agile, like organizations like Amazon, Google, have perfected this. Products that are at various stages of their life cycle within the organization need to be treated differently. So generally organizations like say Amazon, Google and the big organizations, they are able to do it much more better. Like in the book, Syed quotes the example of Google and Pixar, right? So he says that in Google, you have 20% of your work, any employee's work would be on some personal project. So this understands the human personality really well because we don't want to be controlled all the time. We want a little room for maneuver, a little of our own time where we can pursue our own interest, our passion projects. So these passion projects, I feel, by Google incorporating them into their system has made itself that term that Nassim Taleb uses, anti-fragile. This is what I feel makes Google anti-fragile because it is giving scope for people to have that me time, that pursuing their own interests. So that I feel a lot of organizations can learn from, that people should be treated as people for at least some bit. Rest 80% of the time you control them, you analyze them, you do whatever you can do to improve their efficiency. But that 20% time at least you should give to a person. That's a very beautiful thing that Google does.
But the asset list of this will be when Google starts to go through harsher times, whether they keep it or whether they get rid of it. I've seen so many initiatives like this in organizations that were embarked on when times were good and then times were lean, so that's it. And if you do in the first place, because you send such a message, then people's hopes go up and then they go down.
Yes.
The next time, 3 or 5 or 7 years, somebody comes on again, let's do this. You remember what happened last time? So let's see what happens to Google. I hope it works. But for it to work, they'll need to stay committed to it.
Yes.
I think the key thing, it was barely mentioned, but it was about being anti-fragile. And that's basically what learning from failure is becoming stronger from failure. I think that was underplayed, but I think this is really the core of the whole idea of Black Box, is that where he talks about medicine and court, where basically they're invested in their professionalism, in the legal structure. When you see the legal cases where they talk about DNA, they're happy to use the DNA to convict. But like that guy who was clearly innocent and 6 years of fighting to be cleared when the DNA showed he wasn't there. I think the key of it is, rather than being failure averse, like the profession, being more like the airline industry and sports, where we're a learning organization. To me, that's really about being anti-fragile. If you can build the system that's anti-fragile. And the Pixar example is interesting because I read the book of the guy, the CEO, founder or whatever it was of Pixar, and he downplays Steve Jobs' influence in that. He says that Steve Jobs was always very happy to take the credit. But what he really did was he bankrolled them at a time when they were probably going to go bust. And his job as CEO was to keep Steve Jobs out because the people didn't want Steve Jobs. But not many organizations are going to have someone like Steve Jobs or even the Google founders, because most organizations are more mature. They have a career CEO, someone who's grown up. someone who's less inspirational, less revolutionary in their mindset and safer. But it's really about from that mentality, how do organizations plan to make their organizations like anti-fragile?
So it's like our next book coming up here.
Does it fit with the mentality of the mindset of someone who is like a corporate leader?
I used to work in consultancy with project managers, and they were the ultimate safe pair of hands. You could give them your organization and they would run it perfectly. They hadn't got a creative idea in their heads, which they totally accepted, really. So the day would come when it wouldn't work any longer. But in terms of safe pair of hands, these guys, they were the business, really. They were as professionals you could ever get, and as honest as well. But their very modus operandi carried the seeds of its own doom, really. They had no creative ideas. They weren't great with people. They weren't inspired. If it came to shit or bust, they couldn't deal with that. But anything else, they were brilliant. They were brilliant. They were wonderful at distilling huge amounts of complexity into what truly matters, really. It's a balance, trying to get these balances right in your organization. Very hard to do.
It's knowing what type of leadership, because when it's a startup, you want someone that's a more risk taker. When you think of whoever the guy was, Travis something, wasn't it, who set it up, he was obviously brilliant and combative at the time when they needed to break the taxis, the strangleholds, but completely unsuited once it became bigger and there was all the allegations of sexual abuse and harassment and whatever. For most organizations, probably 9 out of 10 times, you want those safe pair of hands. And so they are making the right choice. It's just being able to recognize when, as Steve Jobs says, you can only connect the dots looking backwards. So it's a very hard position to know when you want someone revolutionary and when to stick with a safe pair of hands.
Right. I feel like just coming back to the book about Nassim Taleb's book. So he mentions is your processes are the real hero. It's not the leader who's the real hero.
Yeah.
So the processes which are very robust. So if one of the processes fails, you have those checks and balances already in place in the system. So there is redundancies within the system so that if something goes wrong, then those redundancies come into play and still make the system stable. The central idea of anti-fragility, that the leader should not really matter. If you have created a system and a set of processes, like for example, like just to go in my career, like I work with Siemens. So in Siemens, there are so many processes that half of my day was spent on processes. It was horrible working at Siemens because I am someone who's creative, who doesn't like to work within processes. But such were the systems that if an employee left that same day, like each component of the organization is completely replaced, even the CEO, because such is the strength of the processes. The central idea that your processes and system need to be so strong, so robust that whatever may come, like from his previous book, Black Swan. So even if a Black Swan event comes, if a big disruption comes, so strong is your system, so strong are the processes, and so much redundancy is inbuilt in the system that you are able to push through that. But for that, you need to have a lot of resources. To have those redundancies in place, you need a lot of resources. So most of the organizations, they like to be what we call in today's terms lean. In lean systems, you cannot have anti-fragility. Lean systems will always be agile. So it's a complete antithesis to what anti-fragility is. So there has to be a balance. I feel if you are striving for anti-fragility, then it needs to be a stable, big organization which can overcome whatever may come. Like maybe a Google or an Apple, these kind of organizations are comparatively much more anti-fragile because they have a lot of funds. They have a lot of money lying in the bank, or their stocks are so high that whatever. For example, in this book, the example of Pixar was quoted, wherein they reshot a complete movie despite whatever the cost implications. Or say the example of Google Lens, even though it failed, Google was happy to have these failures. This is in the system only because they are so resourceful. Like Michael was mentioning, that if you have the resources, in good times, you will always be able to bankroll through all these problems. But in those challenging times, you have to have the other mindset, which is like the lean mindset, which is like the complete opposite of that, of anti-fragility. And within an organization, it's always a fight, a tussle between these two systems. One is the lean system and the other is the anti-fragile kind of a system.
One of the things that I felt interesting when Syed mentioned the medical profession right at the beginning, it brought to mind two things. One, there used to be a discipline called work study, which is vilified all over the place. Everybody thinks of a man with a stopwatch, but there were actually two aspects, one time study and one method study. And method study was created by a guy called Frank Bunker Gilbreth. And when he was a young man, his father died, he was sent up to work to be a bricklayer. He discovered at least 3 different ways that he could see at the age of 15 of laying bricks. One is when you were being taught. One was when you were doing it afterwards. And another one was if you were working on piecework rates, i.e. your wage was related to productivity. But the other 2 methods didn't relate to your training method. Really what Gilbreth realized is that we train, people learn, and then they go off and do something different, really. That happens in every sphere of human activity. It happens in every work sphere I've ever been in my life. Now, if we just leave that idea to one side and look at another little piece of research, very obscure, I don't think I've ever come across anybody else who knows about it, but in the early 1960s, an American psychologist called David McClelland, he looked at various professional groups, and the first one was doctors. And he asked the question, when doctors go through medical school in the US, he was looking at the US at the time, he could access all the medical records then. He could see how well they were rated at the time. But once they went out and became doctors, there were no more ratings. What did they do? How could you tell a good doctor from a nut? How could you do it? And he tried various ways of doing this. But what he basically found is that the medical school scores bore no relationship to what happened afterwards. In other words, the doctors just went off and did their thing, in my view. He really found the Gilbreth example in professional spheres. And he looked at other ones. And he got to about his 4th or 5th one, which I think was social work. And then he got closed down. What a surprise. He looked at doctors, nurses, social workers, and somebody else. End of research, kid. Because we don't want you looking in. That happens with doctors. It happens with lawyers. It happens with all sorts of people. So what they actually do, God only knows, really. God only knows. If Syed had got into that about the variation in what people actually do, certainly in professional areas where they've got spheres of discretion, shall we say, it might make another book, actually. Might make another. Because they certainly used to be, especially male ones, used to be famous for their arrogance. That you weren't a good doctor unless you're arrogant. I had a brother-in-law who was Indian, and he came from a family, and he had 18 relatives who were doctors. He was the accountant. He might as well have been a drug dealer, him or something. And he was like the nicest, most honest, successful guy, but he wasn't a doctor. So once you get these professional spheres, nobody's going to admit they were wrong. Not going to happen.
The research you were talking about, Michael, this reminded me, I came across this research when we were doing this, we were going through the book on outliers. The study which you mentioned was the starting point of outliers of the 10,000 hour study. Which was done in
the David McClelland one.
Yeah. So this
I've read that now. I must have missed that.
10,000 hour study.
Okay, I apologize. But when you get into the 10,000 hours, you have to say, what are people actually learning? Are they learning to get better? Are they learning to be arrogant or what, really? It'd be better to spend 3,000 hours learning to get better than 10,000 hours learning other stuff, really.
There's another book, I don't know if you've come across it, The Talent Code by Owen.
Oh, I've got it here, yeah.
He goes a bit more detail into basically how it's about perfect practice. It's not about practice, because if you practice being bad, you just develop being bad. But it's about perfect practice. And he talks about sports people, tennis players will play tennis, or musicians. It's the point where they fall down. So it's continually pushing the point of failure out and out. But he talks about the practice works is the time that you spend. It's like the energy and the attention. What it does is it creates the myelin sheath that hardwires the skill. So that over the 10,000 hours is basically because you're hardwiring your system, your nervous system reacts to that response. McClelland's study, it brings to mind that you're going to get good and bad in whatever occupation people do. Politicians are continually using education as a political football, and all of them come in and they blame teachers. You're going to get the odd bad teacher, you're going to get the odd good one. In the same way, you're going to get bad doctors. And I think that goes back to what you were talking about, Sarab, is that we have to have the processes so that we have redundancy in the system. Another organisation who do create that, again, heavily resourced, is the military, where they have the idea that obviously because in war someone could be wiped out, everyone should be able to do 2 levels above their actual grade so that they can take that role.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. The guy in Taylor Woodrow, no longer Taylor Woodrow, was a British construction company. And the guy who started that, he had the same idea that you should be able to do 2 up and 2 below as it happened. I didn't know that was the case in the military. Is that in case like the next 2 layers up get
I guess so, yeah. I can't remember where I read it. I read it somewhere that it was the military's. I think it's talking to people. Someone in the military told me that the idea is because obviously you're in war, the commander gets taken out. And when you think as a military strategy, going back Alexander the Great and people like that's time, that would be your strategy. Take out the leader and the organisation collapses without guidance.
Things you learn. I would think that's quite difficult practice. See, if you're typical squaddy, going to sergeant to captain, though, that's quite a height, really.
Yeah, because there is, I'm pretty sure, I'm not that familiar with the military, but there are certain levels that you can't go above. If you don't go in as an officer, there's a certain limit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. An NCO, yeah.
But I think they have to be aware of is that they could take up the role in emergency. So, yeah, another thing I felt interesting was about the psychotherapists and about how they have no measurement. What got me was the idea of religion. And it makes me think of why religions have been sidelined in today's. Joseph Campbell used to say that the religion of the day has to fit with the science of the day. And we have a religion that's 2,000 years behind the science of the day. And Galileo is used quite often by Syed. And wasn't it he was killed for the basic same idea because he wouldn't recount it? The idea that when they found that the world was older, they said, no, that's just God-made fossils. The narrative has to change to fit. We have to be aware of the cognitive distortions. When you look at I can't remember what it was, but the slowness of the adoption rate, where it was like 60 years. When Semmelweis was a doctor that realized why so many babies and mothers were dying in childbirth because of germs on the hands, he basically, I think he did some research which proved the point, but it took 40 years because of the arrogance of doctors. And they're like, I'm not washing my hands. All it took was them washing their hands. And I really like that story. What Provost, the guy who was in with the surgeon, and he said, she's dying because of a latex allergy. Look, it will be 5 minutes for you to change your gloves. You'll lose if I'm wrong. If I'm right, she'll die. And he's, no, I'm not changing them. How many times would we have someone in that position? It's the willingness to accept that we're wrong. When we come from a point of view, which is like the old tribes and the religions, we believe a book has the answer, the definitive answer. We remove the right to advise. And I think that's a danger, all of us individually, socially, and in corporates.
Absolutely. I feel like, for example, if we take the example of constitution compared to a religion, the constitution is continuously being amended by the people based on the problems that we are facing right now in the society. On the other hand, in religion, the problem, especially with certain religions, which are said that this is the word of God. And if you just say that it is word of God, you are closing the conversation then and there. So there is no scope for any improvement or disagreement with whatever that is written. That I feel is a major problem with religion. Wherever you say that it is word of God and this has to be followed no matter what. That's what Syed calls closed loop thinking, right? We then are unable to improve and make any changes in the system. That's one of the major reasons why I feel most of the religions are failing in contemporary times, because they have those single books. Religions which have multiple books are not failing. So this is a change like that has taken place in certain religions where there are thousands of books and no one claims that it is written by any god. These are all stories, myths, legends, and these are guidelines. So if they are just guidelines and no one is forcing you to do anything, so then why not take the best out of whatever books that you are reading and apply it to the society of now? That's what I feel like. There are certain religions which are very closed, very dogmatic, based on the traditionalists group. They would believe whatever you tell them. These traditionalists or conservatives, as we call the extremist end of the conservatives, which would be somewhere around 8 to 10% in any society. And the overall conservatives would be somewhere around 40% in a society. These are, again, psychological studies done on the complete diaspora of the world. So this is quite common that the number of people in a society that would be conservatives would be roughly around 30 to 50%. And within that, the extremists of the conservatives would be around 8 to 10. Similarly, on the other end of the spectrum, the left center, like the left people would be the extremist end would be 8 to 10%. And similarly, the society is constructed like these sort of the bell curve of overall how the society functions. It's a very intricate play. No single person is the same, right? We all have our way of looking at the world. And even the books that people are reading, we read the same book, but we have a complete different perspective of the book. And probably 8.4 billion or whatever number of people there are in the world, they will read this book. They will all have certain differences in how they perceive the book. That's the beauty. Like even in case of religion, there would always be people who would believe each and every word to it without changing it, and they would be okay with it. And then there would be people who are open, who want change. So the perception of religion for each one of us is also very different.
I remember years ago somebody giving 3 examples of what Syed calls closed loop systems. Psychoanalysis, interestingly enough, communism and Catholicism. Because the argument was that if you were in them, you were in them. There was just no way out of them. It doesn't matter what you said. There was no way out. I was brought up as a Catholic. And one of the things that we were told was that we had what was called the doctrine of papal infallibility. When the Pope spoke as the Pope, he could not be wrong. So if he gave you a hot bet for the 3:30, some race course, that might be wrong. But when he spoke as the Pope, he was right. And that kind of sounded good, sounded reasonable. But it was only when I was ghostwriting a book about Pope that I found that a particular Pope invented this in 1860. Up until that date, no Pope had ever claimed papal infallibility, not a single Pope ever. And this guy just dreamed it out of thin air. And when he announced it in the Basilica of St. Peter to the cardinals, they were absolutely shocked because it's like, where'd this come from? Apparently there was a huge storm going on at the time. And as he announced it, there was a thunderbolt, a flash of lightning. And this piece of glass came flying out, crashed down, just shattered in a million pieces. It was like, God is not amused. Ironically, within 5 years, they lost all their estates in Italy, in the middle of Italy, the papal estates. So the guy made the thing up and it's stuck there ever since. Nobody's turned around and said, look, we should bin this.
It seems so much like the Emperor's New Clothes. Basically, when you look at Christianity and when you look at Buddhism, now, Jesus, basically the Sermon on the Mount says, don't be like the Philistines, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And then he died and other people set up a religion in his name, basically doing everything he said don't do. I think what's really important is that we have to have some sense of spirituality. By spirituality, I mean there's some sense of connection of how do we originate, what are we here for, what's the bigger picture? And everyone has to have that. Religion is an off-the-shelf, easy way of doing that. Buddha basically said the same, is don't believe me, don't believe anyone else because it's written somewhere. Judaism, Islam and Christianity all take a book. That becomes a closed-loop system. And then people like popes get power by saying, oh, you can't talk to God, you've got to talk to me and I'll talk to God for you. So you have a system that here in the Middle Ages, the clergy were milking people and saying, if you pay me this money, I'll have a word and absolve you from this sin. We have these scams going on today, and today we clearly see it's a scam. But when people are in that mindset of the religion, oh, it's written in this book, you're trapped, and it is. And the danger is that we, in many other ways, we do this, and we trap ourselves within authority figures. Even like here in the UK, like Henry VIII, because he was fighting with the Pope, he said, hang on, I'm the Pope now. Basically, we're going to have our own religion and I'm going to be the boss of it. And so the king or the queen is, if your UK Protestants are basically the head of the church, is the sovereign.
Why not?
And yet they surround themselves with the pageantry and the things that it can't be challenged. And I think CEOs probably do a similar thing, and people in organizations create ways that people can't oppose and challenge them.
Syed makes that point very well in part of the book when he says that the further up you go up organization, the more denial there is if things aren't right. When you get close to CEOs, there are very few people actually going to turn around and say, look, sorry guys, I got it all wrong. Some people will. Thank you.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting was to see how widespread it is. He used the example of Tony Blair and George Bush. But equally, Neil deGrasse Tyson, when he wrote about a quote that George Bush had said, which made his point that he was anti-Islam and all of this thing. And the quote was a complete misrepresentation. It was never said, and it was a misrepresentation of a speech taken out of context. So I suppose at the end, what we're really looking at is our ability to learn is limited by our lack of awareness of our cognitive distortions. This is something that we all have, and it talks about blame. And I always find the fundamental attribution error where we excuse ourselves. I think that comes down to being human. Is we experience ourselves internally and we experience others externally. So we look at the end result and the behaviors of what other people do, and we can see all their faults, but we feel the excuses and the justifications for why we do what we do. And that's something that's very hard to overcome, isn't it?
It's interesting. One of the things I would take issue with Syed for is blame, because he seems to accept it and I don't. I think blame is a very useless emotion precisely because it is an emotion. Blame is not just saying you did something wrong. It's putting an emotional attachment on that mistake. I think it's a huge difference. There are two components of blame. One, the mistake. Two, the emotional response to it. The emotional response, because it's negative, completely wrecks any opportunity of learning from it. I think you just have to say, we're human, we make mistakes. If the person made a mistake, he or she made a mistake. But the minute you stick blame on, ouch, you're going nowhere really. You're pushing them into a corner. It's showing everybody else the example. This is what happens. People who get things wrong. I really think blame is a worthless emotion, really, that we just all need to just get rid of. Just accept we do things wrong. Other people do things wrong. Are we going to learn from it? Are we going to get a bit better? To me, that's the question.
But my experience in relationships has led me to believe that there are three enemies of relationships. And that is blaming, shaming, and gaming, is where we try and manipulate people, but through gaming, we shame people by going, oh, you're a bad person in order to control, or we blame. And it is that discharge of emotion. I think that's Brené Brown describes blame as a discharge of negative emotion.
I have
Steve Jones worked at Unilever apparently before becoming a leading geneticist. When I was studying psychology, my tutor clearly came from the evolutionary psychology. He was a big fan of Steve Jones. His son was doing his PhD under Steve Jones at that time. I found it interesting, the idea of Unilever finding their nozzle through thousands of iterations. And it makes me think that there's a biological equivalent. When you look at one of our great dangers is antibiotics, because the bacteria multiply so much faster than we do and faster than we can react to them, that there is this kind of bacterial warfare. And it makes me think that biology is a great analogy that we need to find the psychological equivalent of, which really seems to be about being able to drop our preconceived ideas. He talks about narrative fallacy, but what we're really talking about is we need to be constantly updating the narrative.
Like what I feel is, for example, like what this book also talks about is neuroplasticity, right? That our brain can be rewired if the proper effort is put into a certain thing, rewiring. But what I feel is most of the times we are not even aware of the biases that we are having and the origin of those biases. We talked about in some part that there is a limbic reaction to a lot of things which are from our past evolution. So we are not even sure where those emotions are coming from. Why are we negatively wired towards certain emotions? Like, for example, blame, just what we were talking about. Whenever there is someone blames us, we get into that fight or flight response. We don't want to be blamed. We take it personally. You cannot take out the personal. It's not so easy to separate yourself. So those emotions, whatever we feel, they are our reality. That cannot be changed in that sense. The depth of those emotions, that until and unless you are self-realized, probably is what the term that we use. Until and unless you are that, blame and these negative emotions will always negatively affect us.
The more we're aware of them, the greater chance there is that we will not let them negatively affect us if we so choose, really. But if we're not aware of them, then we're in thrall of them. So if you can stand outside yourself and realize what you're doing, then you can start to rewire your brain about it. If you don't do that, you're just going to do the same thing forever, really.
Absolutely.
I've got a friend whose 3-year-old mum's got like a PhD in blame. She could do it at the drop of a hat. She ain't going to change.
Oh, yeah.
Syed talks about we studied 240,000 studies or something in physics and like less than 10,000 or something in education. This has always been my view in we don't know relationships, we don't know emotions because it's something that we don't study. It's so new to us. And comes to mind is that statistic that was it 85 to 90% of people think they're self-aware, but when you cross-reference it, it's only 10 to 15%.
10 to 15%.
And the perennial one is people are like, oh yeah, I watch adverts, but they don't influence me. And yet billions are spent and many more billions are made because of the influence of adverts.
Yes. Another thing that comes, straight away to mind is 95% of it is system 1, right? Like Daniel Kahneman's book and Thinking Fast and Slow, which is referenced here as well. So 95% of the things we do automatically. And it's only 5% of the time that we are using system 2. So just think of it in the course of the day. 95% of the time we are anyways using system 1. That means that most of the things we are doing are coming out of the autonomous response system that is already wired. Whatever we talk about neuroplasticity is only when we are using system 2, that 5% of the time. So most of the things that we are doing, that we might think that we know the reason of why it is happening. What is the emotional response to it? We are aware of it only 5% of the time. Only when we are making really tough choices or really important things, we only use that brain because it's not in our capacity to always be self-aware 100% of the time in that sense. You cannot expect when you are applying these kind of things to organizations, you just cannot expect the whole system to work in that way because 95% of the decisions would be driven by the processes. It's only in those 5% of the time or decision making that system 2 can take place or changes can take place. But such has been the pace of change in today's world that we are unable to adjust. And that's the reason why the lives of organizations have reduced to say from 20 to 30 years to now a span of 7 years. Because organizations are unable to cope with that pace of change.
Which do you think we've been in, system 1 or system 2 for the past sort of hour and a bit? Which do you think we've been in?
Oh, I think it would be like most of the time it would be system 2 because we are in a sort of continuous interaction mode, right? We are talking to each other. We are looking at each other's eyes. We are trying to decipher things. We are trying to understand. So whenever we are using our processing powers like to the fullest extent and being in the now, like Eckhart Tolle's book, Power of Now. So when we are in the now, we are at the present and completely involved in the task. At those moments, I feel the system 2 works much better because we are discerning, we are listening, we are open and we are able to discern between what is right and wrong or not right, which is sitting in our systems or way of thinking. We are open to change it. That's where I feel system 2 works. And that's why I feel the conversation at least has taken place in system 2.
But there's more than 5% of the time. Today, anyway.
I think this is something that most people understand is the nature of organizations makes people stressed. For so many reasons, you're putting people under stress. And it's like that quote from Archaeologists, people don't rise to our aspirations, they fall to the level of their training. Often people are stressed. And so that like, I think of the triune brain, I know it's been disproved. As a rule of thumb, it's a nice way of thinking that we can only think from our highest thinking abilities when we're relaxed and calm. For us here, there's really nothing at stake. We're in a nice environment. We're not stressed with each other. We don't have any ongoing issues. Each of our decisions doesn't affect our future, where when you're in an organization, someone else is making decisions that is directly impacting your future, which I think is the same as in a relationship. We've got this time booked out that we can explore calmly, but often in organizations, we're running from one thing to another. We've got ongoing concerns which make us stressed. And it's the lack of awareness of how people are feeling and which system that they're operating in.
Completely agree. And I always feel that if people are stressed, that stress is telling them something that's very valuable if they choose to listen to it.
Yeah. And I think it's the norm. When you look at organizations, what the burnout rate and the quiet quitting and all of this stuff, it shows you how stressed people are every day. And that means that you go back to that quote of we expect people their aspirations. When I think of interviews, traditionally people have interviewed and they're all prepared. They've got their best suit on. They're all prepared with their best self. They're most charming. They're giving you full attention. 3 months into the job and they're pissed off with their co-worker and they're fed up with how they've been treated and they're unhappy with the organization. You're not getting the best out of them. And yet we're expecting, why aren't they showing up? You have to plan that you have to either create the environment so that people rise up and the culture and the whole connection and the sense of belonging and giving them status and things so that they do, or you accept far less and you plan for it. I don't think there's that awareness.
No, there absolutely isn't. There absolutely isn't.
Michael and I, we have a background in psychology, and psychology has very little impact on the world. There's far less influence and there's far less study on it. We're not bringing that influence in, and people aren't generally aware of it. When people talk of psychology, they think that people can read their minds or they know what you're thinking, and this kind of thing. They're still talking about Freud, Pavlov, and not developing from that knowledge.
Yes. I feel, for example, what we're just talking about, major factor missing in organizations is the psychological safety. Awareness about it is there. I would not say that the top leaders don't understand that psychological safety is important. I feel they understand. Now with so much being talked about it, they are aware of it. But to implement it, that would mean to invest a lot of amount on something that is not tangible. In the sense, you cannot see the cost benefit analysis of it. So until and unless there is a quote, something that cannot be measured or something
can't be managed.
If you cannot measure it, it's very difficult to implement certain things or certain processes in organizations. Even though I feel this is all talk and nothing. This is all, even the overall HR department, I feel is of no use. They are not really taking care of people as such. What the role, they don't really take care of people. All they are involved in is how can you increase productivity? How can you improve effectiveness? These are the terms that are being used. If we really want psychological safety, terms like kindness, terms like courage, terms like being vulnerable, these should be discussed. Since they are not measurable, I feel is the core of the problem. That until and unless we can make all these factors measurable in some way, organizations will probably not accept it or make use of it, because all they care about is profitability at the end of the day. Right? So yeah, that's what I feel resonance is.
Yeah, I think that organizations are basically are driven by money. Everything is related to money. But the problem is that was fine in industrial times. But when you're working with knowledge, to access the resources that people have, their full engagement, their full creativity, they need to have a sense of purpose. Our organizations are set up to maximize money. There's a breaking point where they can't maximize money because they can't get the most out of the people. Ultimately, if all you're doing is maximizing money, you're reaching a point where society breaks because all that you do is enable greed. And that was great for a point where it created the most progress, but there's a point where it has to change and society has to qualitatively change and organizations within that. I think what Syed did in both books is he brought in lots of concepts. There's an underlining theme of psychological safety, the self-awareness, anti-fragility. But what it comes down to in the end, I think for me, is the ability to let go of ego. And I think a great source of growth over the next few decades is going to be the sense of identity. Because I think for me, what we have to change is identity. We have to learn how we can join with others so that we're an individual, but we're also part of a team, we're part of a family, we're part of a society. And when we have that sense of that we give fully of ourselves without losing, then I think we'll be better as a society individually and in every way.
I feel Blackbox Thinking is very closely related to Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, and both have a lot of pairs in terms of how our mindset should be so that we are able to continuously reinvent ourselves in a way that we learn from whatever mistakes we make. We see challenges as opportunities to learn. At the end of the day, Blackbox Thinking is all about being open and curious about the world. That's my sort of key. There are a lot of other concepts, especially the biases part really interested me because I feel one of it is related to self-awareness at the end of the day. Whatever growth we go through depends on the level of our self-awareness. So that is the foundation on which everything else about our mindset is built around. Taking these two concepts together, how we can increase our self-awareness and be aware of our biases, and how we can grow and be open and curious, be accountable as well as follow certain processes so that we can continuously improve. So having those balances and having that is so necessary for growth, I feel. And that's very beautifully captured. So that's my key takeaway from.
Thank you.
Oh gosh, what do I feel about the book? Lots of things. I was brought up at a time and in a culture where failure was simply unacceptable. So I had a terrible attitude to failure. Because it was unacceptable, I just had to shut it out. I couldn't learn from it at all. I've probably spent most of my life redefining my relationship with failure and trying to get it in its right place as a learning vehicle. And yes, I think open and curious is the way to go forward, because we can let failure define us negatively, or we can use failure to move forward. It depends how we view it, really.
It's so much about that attitude, isn't it?
Yes. I think open and curious, I think that pretty much nails it. There's a guy called Bill Bonner spoke about Forex trades, and he used almost the same words. He said it's very important to, with something and curious, but he meant open and curious. He said remain open. He said to remain an interested observer, even when you're in the trade, and even when it's not working, to still be just interested in what's going on and just look at it. He meant open and curious.
Yeah, not invested in any one way, which is the problem, is we tend to invest our identity into, a way of thinking or succeeding or even failing.
In trading, the roller coaster is one of greed and fear. And of course, people's egos are going up and crashing. And he's just saying, look, just watch it. Just sit there watching it and learning. That's what he's saying. Be open and curious.
Good advice to us all. Okay, thank you for this. And next up is Saurabh's favourite of Mastery. And then
it's an amazing book.
I haven't read it yet. I've got audio and I've got the Kindle, but I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, wow.
I've got it on Kindle. I'm really looking forward to reading it. So thank you for suggesting it.
Okay.